Okay, and we should be live for you guys right now. And if you're watching this in the replay afterwards, then just scroll down and you should see some timestamps of what we've been discussing in today's session. And otherwise, you can scroll forward and see all of the questions that we answered. And you should be able to see that I've cut off the top of my head so the screen can pan down and you guys can see poor little Shatsy, who, believe it or not, he does not sleep all the time. I promise. You guys might have seen him in our live stream just yesterday. It's because of the time of the day. I happen to pick these things. So let me see. I'm going to reposition myself a little bit here. There we go. So I want to answer all of your language learning questions today, and you guys get to watch a puppy while I do that. So this is an extra bonus that you may actually get this bonus in most of my upcoming live videos if he's happy enough to grace your presence here. So Deanna says, hey Shatsy, and let's see what other questions you guys are seeing. We've got Vittorio da Regno Unito. Very happy to see you back here again. Hopefully you're able to hear me now. And why is he called Shatsy? Shatsy is German for little treasure. It's kind of an older word, usually used between couples. But I just looked at him. He really felt like a Shatsy. He's a Dachshund, which is a German breed. So I had to give him a German name to answer that question. So let's see. What questions have you guys got for me today? We've been talking to Holly, who's coming to us from Mexico. And can we talk about Shatsy and how adorable he is? That was mostly the theme of yesterday's video, but you're welcome to ask me questions about Shatsy as well if you like. I'll get to them after some language learning questions. And excellent. Okay, so I'm getting pretty caught up here, and you guys are welcome to ask anything that you think I could help you with. And while I'm waiting for your questions, I can tell you a couple of upcoming travels that I have. I might be able to run into some of you guys. I'm going to be in Plattsburgh, and that's going to be tomorrow night. And so there's a university I'm speaking at there. I'm going to be in Atlanta, Georgia for one day on like Friday through Saturday, just a day there. I might be able to see some people. And then I'll be at a couple of conferences in San Diego. So that'll be next week. And you'll be able to follow along on social media. And in case you haven't seen it yet, this guy has his own Instagram account. Just look for Polypup, like polyglot, but then the glot is replaced with PUP. And that's where all of his updates are going to go. I put it on my own Instagram, but then it would just turn into a dog Instagram. Let's face it, he's photogenic. Okay. Which languages does Shatsy speak? I'm going to teach him various commands in different languages. And so we'll get to, I don't know, like for now, we haven't been getting him into learning tricks just yet because we just got him. And he's only 3 months old. Look at him. He's just barely able to sleep on command. So that's a start, you know. So Holly has a question. Any advice for a couple who just moved to Mexico who wants to practice Spanish together? We're used to only speaking English, so making the switch is hard. Okay, so when Lauren and I first moved in together, we were living in Spain. And in that case, I was the one speaking mostly Spanish because she didn't have a Spanish project just yet. And what happened was, when we were out of the house, it was tricky because I would try to teach her a couple of things, but it wasn't a real project. So what I found when I've gone in immersion with friends, at least, is to make sure that we're communicating with other people as much as possible. So communicating with one another, I've always found when I've had this conversation many times with people, and communicating between two friends or partners who've been together a long time in one language, it's difficult to make that switch. It's more difficult than just the general language learning process, even if you both guys speak the language as it is. But it's also hard because you just are used to speaking one particular language with that person. So what helps is individually, you may be out and speaking in Spanish with other people, but what might help a lot is if you socialize as much as possible, because if you're with a group of people who just speak Spanish, the both of you are more likely to speak Spanish. And you'll speak Spanish together just out of politeness because other people can hear you. And you can try, and it's mostly just motivation and your lifestyle and how good you are getting into those routines, that the two of you at home might be able to speak more Spanish. And I would encourage you to do that. But I also know from having this conversation with many, many couples that just making that switch when you're used to speaking another language together is very difficult. So don't put all your pressure on speaking to one another, but do try to be as social as possible so the two of you are out together, because then together you'll speak Spanish when other people are around. And I hope that gives you some food for thought there, Holly. Okay, and let's see. Learning English asks, what's the difference between the British and the Irish accent? Is an Irish accent more like a British or an American accent? So this is tricky, because Irish English written is essentially British English. So there's no difference in how I would write the English language, spelling-wise, grammar-wise. It's British English, like in formal written form. But then what makes some people think that an Irish accent, how it sounds, might sound more American, is almost entirely centered on one particular sound, and that's the letter R, because they have this thing called received pronunciation in the UK, which is kind of the more famous posh British accent, if you look at it that way, where they don't pronounce the letter R. So a C-A-R might be pronounced as a car, whereas I say car, which is closer to essentially the same as how an American might say it. So because of that, people would say, oh, an Irish accent sounds more like an American accent because it's a very prominent letter. What's actually going on here, which is interesting from a linguistic and historical perspective, is that both myself, Irish people, and American people speak English more closely to how it was spoken a few hundred years ago in England. So it's weird, but English, as we speak it, it was kind of the international English, the one English, and over time it changed in the UK to have that received pronunciation, as well as many other changes. That's like just one example. But that's why our English is a little bit closer to the older English, like how Shakespeare spoke would be a lot more like how I speak compared to how any British person might speak. And this is counterintuitive, but that's why the accent may be thought of as being closer. It's more that the British accent very strongly stands out, and it's also like any accent that would have stemmed from that, or like anything from the UK in general, because the UK has a lot of accents. Same with Ireland. Ireland has a lot of accents. There is no one Irish accent, one British accent. But yeah, I hope that kind of gives you a little bit of stuff to think about. The accents, whether they sound the same or not, is up to the person listening. Obviously, I wouldn't think that myself, and Americans always instantly know that I'm not from here. But I understand when people hear, because of that R that I pronounce, and when they're not native English speakers, they might think I'm American. So I haven't lived here, so I've been saying a couple of things, like I have found myself saying I get them mixed up now. I say tomato sometimes now without thinking about it, even though tomato is how I naturally say it, just because I've been living in New York for a while. Okay, so I hope that answers that question. So Dominikas asked, do you know any Lithuanian? And let me see, I just want to make sure I'm not missing any of your comments as I'm scrolling. Good. So Lithuanian, no, I haven't learned any Lithuanian, but I would like to someday. That's definitely on my travel list of places I haven't been to yet. So I could say that's definitely a possible language I'll learn in the future. So keep an eye out. I'll obviously be announcing it if and when I do. And when can you see on video? Oh, I don't know. Whenever. I don't have a long-term plan with my languages just yet. Okay. What else can we say? Okay, so what vid1 asks, can I speak to my newborn baby in French with my intermediate level and with not a perfect accent? Is it beneficial or detrimental for the baby? I would say it's definitely beneficial, because keep in mind the baby's going to learn how to speak as well in school, and that will craft how they speak the language so that their teachers, like presuming you would send them to a French speaking school, or maybe you'll get them homeschooled. But I think if you're thinking just in terms of you being the sole person teaching the language, then that's not as ideal as it could be. But if you are speaking it in conjunction with sending them to a you had a bad dream, you got startled, sorry about that. Poor little guy. So if you imagine finding like a tutor who would see them regularly, that tutor could correct them. But exposure to the language, even with intermediate learners, is very, very useful, especially if they're just starting and they're very young. Any mistakes you would make as an intermediate speaker aren't the kind that would necessarily burn into them just yet. So it's not something I would imagine you have to worry too much about. But definitely make sure you're doing that in conjunction with them speaking to a native, if that helps. Okay. Juan Anton says, do you have any good tips for creating a good study location? Yeah, because when I've had some of my projects, I do have like virtual learning environments sometimes, and essentially I would make, like, even in your own home, designate a corner, like buy a very cheap table secondhand and designate that as your, French table or whatever, and just setting out a mental space that you do specifically just that language here. So if you work a lot from home, then, like, for instance, I do a lot of work at this desk here. So if I was actively learning a language, I might decide I am not going to be learning the language at this desk because it's where I work, and I have a smaller desk over there, and I would choose that desk to be my study desk. So that physical space helps, just a like simple separation there. Making sure you don't have access to something like your TV. So my reading, I do have a TV in this office, but my reading chair that I like to sit on to start my day reading a little bit, and what the chair I would use if I was studying, is facing the wall that it just cannot possibly see the TV. So making sure you have very restricted access to things like that, and just generally preventing yourself from using distracting technology. So I study in my office, but I actually installed a curtain. I would show you if I didn't have a dog on me right now. I would get up and move the camera to show it. But I have a curtain that I can pull to separate all of the technology, because I have my office here, and I have a gaming station as it is, and the TV. But then I pull the curtains, and it's a purely non-technology area for me to study. And if any technology comes in, it's going to be in airplane mode or something like that, so that I'm just using it for the purpose intended. And if you're doing it out of the house, then something that, again, reducing distractions, maybe not the cafe that all your friends tend to show up in, because then they'll interrupt you before getting into your workflow. But other than that, don't try to be too much of a perfectionist about it, because if you are if you find your local library and just set yourself up to study there, that's as good as anywhere else. Just get into it, But I hope a couple of those tips don't, or I hope they point you in the right direction. Okay. So, Dominicus is offering any help with Lithuanian if I need it. Thank you for that. And you have a pop call Gizmo. You wonder what Shatsy's dreaming about, Juan Anton. I wonder too. I'll ask him when he wakes up. I'll pass on the message. Okay. So you've learned pretty much every major Romance language except Romanian. Do you have any plans to look maybe into a mini mission with it? Yeah, like essentially, it's always interesting as I was learning languages that people would always think of it in terms of the language families for choosing the language. Like, obviously, you got to think about it in terms of language families because there's commonalities, you have advantages, and I get that. But I never set out to learn Romance languages. I set out to learn French because I wanted to live in France, Portuguese because I wanted to live in Brazil, and so on. And it just worked out that way. So I would definitely plan to visit Romania someday and learn it. And that's kind of what it's about for me, is am I going to that place? It's never been about language families. And like whenever I've picked a new language, I haven't really considered as a factor for me picking that language whether it's related or not. So you could well see me learn Romanian, and if I did, obviously that would be an easier project than if I was to take on a completely unrelated language, because I would have a lot of advantages, especially from my Italian, that if I understand right is the closest of the Romance languages that I would know. But I wouldn't necessarily pick it because it was a Romance language. You know, I always need to be motivated by the culture and the people and all that, if that makes any sense. But I definitely want to visit someday, and that's what it's going to come down to. And as you guys who've been following me know, I'm currently working on, struggling to work on my time organization project. And I'm going to give you an update on that when I'm back from my next trip. The trips have broken it up quite a bit, of course. That's just naturally going to happen. But I have a trip coming up that I just mentioned at the start, or maybe I mentioned in the other video, I forget. And when I get back from that, I'm going to give you the next update and show you the tools I've been using, what definitely has worked for me and what hasn't. And I'll make videos specifically about that. But I need to have those efficiency projects down before I get into my next language project. And this is just an absolute necessity for me, because if I start a new learning project now with my current workflow, I know there's no way I'm going to make a decent amount of progress. And fixing that workflow, similar to fixing your study space. Oh, is he stirring? Is he ready to make a public appearance on camera? Yeah, he's looking at you guys. He's wondering what's going on. Why is this? Oh no, he's down again. Never mind. Never mind. He's still sleeping. He's a very sleepy little puppy. Okay, so let's see a couple of questions then. Let's see, are on topic. Vittorio da Regno Unito says, do you know any tips to reduce your native accent and have a more natural accent of the language that you're learning? Yeah, sure. So firstly, I wouldn't worry too much about it up until the intermediate stage, because your accent is a kind of one of the less important things to be focusing your energy on. But I would say if you're at the intermediate and especially advanced stage, absolutely work on your accent. The stuff that my friend Idausa does on Mimic Method, and you'll see links. Actually, Holly, would you mind sharing a link to some of his stuff in the chat there? So his stuff, what he does is he focuses on the individual sounds separated from the written form, because the written form is what ultimately is a very big reason why we have an accent. So if you imagine I'm learning French and I see I am Irish, I see that written out, then I am biased as a native English speaker to pronounce that as je suis irlandais, or an American twang probably put a bit into that one. So you're more biased to pronouncing it that way. And that's because it's how it would be pronounced with your native tongue if you were to put the English R on it and so on. And what we would change there is get rid of focusing on the written form and just focus on the individual pronunciations themselves and like the phonetics of it. So you might use a little of the International Phonetic Alphabet, but especially what you would do, like even forgetting symbols and all that, what you do is focus on audio form. So you might take je suis irlandais, and you would take that kind of a phrase and you would break it up and you would try really hard to get each individual sound as close as you could to how a native speaker or the audio is pronouncing it. And you would repeat that. You would then say it to a native speaker. And there's a lot of great tools online. SoundCloud, for instance, lets you do comments on individual moments within the actual clip itself. So in like 5 seconds in, they might say, your J is too harsh, for instance. So that's kind of the kind of thing that you're likely to be able to work on when you're treating it as an audio problem. So get away from what you're writing down and making notes that, you know, the J sounds like an S in measure. That is useful to a certain degree, but listening and repeating and making it entirely an audible exercise is a really important part of working on your accent. And then the other part, I would say, is the musicality, something people really tend to neglect when they get into language learning, is how the rhythm of the language works. And this is something that I learned in a couple of my languages with music teachers, and it's a tip I always like to bring up. If you can, to find a music teacher or a speech therapist, because both of them are very, very good at what they do in picking up on audio ways of helping native speakers. That is very, very useful and can be applied to learning other languages. And in my case, the one I worked the hardest on, the accent-wise, was my Brazilian Portuguese. And my music teacher helped me realize not just my pronunciation, because pronunciation is important, but the rhythm of how I was speaking the language. And that's kind of what it ultimately came down to. So that's a couple of things to help you with the accent idea. Okay. So Dominikas asked, how do I learn German vocabulary better, especially the conjugative words? I mean, the words that are conjugated. So learning vocabulary better is one question. That's a combination of maybe mnemonics, like using Memrise, and flashcards like Anki are always good for that. But if you're thinking of the learning conjugations, then I don't know what level you're currently at in German, but if you are at a lower level, especially the A1 and even sometimes A2, I would say it's okay to not get all the conjugations totally correct. That is not one of the things that's going to hinder your ability to communicate enough. It has to be one of your biggest focuses. So I would just say things incorrectly. I always say to people when I started learning Spanish, which has a lot of complex conjugation to learn, which doesn't get enough credit for it in making it more expressive and deeper language to learn than when people dismiss it as an easy one. But that was a big problem for me. So what I did was I just spoke with the infinitive a few times. I would say, yesterday I to eat a pizza. And that's, ayer yo comer una pizza. And that is not a correct sentence. But if I, in that moment, can't think of the right conjugation, saying that will at least allow the conversation to move forward. If you're an absolute beginner, you do not want to get bogged down with getting all of those conjugations right, because that's not what's preventing you from speaking. It becomes a bigger issue later on. So then when you do get to later on, try to learn it in terms of patterns. So don't learn individual word conjugations. Learn the patterns of conjugations. So words that end a certain way tend to be conjugated a particular way. And do lots of exercises and get your teacher to help you, so that they might ask you, what would you do if you won the lottery? And you would, that kind of use of the conjugation, you would try to apply that. And it would especially mean, like, what are the forms that you have the greatest trouble with, and just practice them. Maybe you have the greatest trouble distinguishing between, like, the different persons, like, I eat, you eat, he, she eat, it eats. Maybe that's the problem. And maybe it's the different tenses. I ate, I will eat. And so figure out what your greatest weakness is, and then make a study session about that. And especially a good grammar book will explain it to you if you're at the intermediate or above levels. Otherwise, it might be a bit too soon. So I hope that helps. SS asks, how many hours per day should we study for language learning? I would say 24. There's 24 hours in a day. That's the magic number. That's the absolute best amount that'll give you the best and greatest results, is 24 hours in a day. In case you can't tell, the answer is that there's no real answer. That's not really my answer, because not sleeping and not eating would be detrimental to your language learning progress, and dying of starvation from not being able to afford food because you're not working your day job, that would also be detrimental to your language learning progress. So I would just say as many hours as you could. During my intensive projects, I made it essentially like a full-time job, almost 8 hours a day learning a language. But I would do that during a 3-month period right after 9 months of saving up enough money that I could take 3 months off. And a lot of people can't do that. And that means that your situation is different. But there's no magic number. If I tell you 1 hour, then why wouldn't you do 2 hours? If I tell you 2 hours, why wouldn't you do 3? So there's no magic number. You just try to do as much as you can, and the more hours you do on a day-to-day basis, the better your progress is going to be. But within reason, because you might reach a certain amount of hours that is too exhausting for you and that stresses you out too much. So what is realistic for you, that's the amount that you should try to do. There's no magic number, unfortunately. Deanna asks, which level on the Sephora system would you be considered officially fluent for professional purposes? That is a very controversial question because, unfortunately, there is no official understanding of the word fluency. This is one that has caused me many, many headaches in online forums and many, let's say, not so pleasant conversations with people who would get mad at me for when I define my level of fluency. And the problem is there's no real consensus with that word. But what I have found within the language learning community, that other polyglots do tend to agree with me. Many don't, but a lot do. For instance, Steve Kaufman, he also would say, and people would think of us as disagreeing on some things. We agree on quite a lot. And one that we definitely agree on is you can start saying that you're fluent from level B2 and up. So B2, the upper intermediate level. And the reason for me personally that this is where you would say you can start to say that you're fluent, because keep in mind, you're also fluent at C1 and C2. But you would start to say you're fluent at B2 because you can function in social situations pretty much like you would in your native language. So if you're when I was a B2 in Spanish, I could go down to the pub and hang out with Spanish people and have conversations without slowing the conversation down too much. There was a lot I couldn't do. I couldn't hold a debate in the language. I couldn't work professionally as an electronic engineer in the language because that would require a lot of specific vocabulary and experience applying that. But I could function socially. So it's difficult because when you apply for jobs, you want to just make it simple and say, oh, I speak it fluently. But it's so hard, and it's why whenever I get interviewed on TV, for instance, and they say, what languages do you speak fluently? I hate that question so much because it's a loaded question because it already implies some definition of the word fluency that nobody agrees on. So I always have to add a tag to, well, I speak Spanish, French, German, and list the languages at the upper intermediate level, or I'm socially equivalent in those languages, and I understand this as fluency, and a lot of people would agree with me. But some wouldn't. And I have to say that, and that's very, very difficult for TV soundbites because they just want me to say 7 or 5 and 10 or whatever number. That's what they want to hear. It's nice and simple. But fluent does not have an agreed definition, and so I always just opt for the European Common Framework or try to clarify what I mean by fluent. For some people, if you're like professional level or close to native, then that is a very different thing, and I would say that mastery in the language is the next level, and sometimes what they think of fluency is what I would call mastery, and I think that's overkill for most purposes of people learning languages. Okay, so Lee asks, Benny, I recently purchased your Spanish course and I'm really impressed. Thank you very much. Although I personally disagree with you on your speak from day one approach, I got a lot out of it. Great work. Yeah, and that's totally fine. One thing I had in mind when I was writing those books and when I was writing my first one, Fluent in 3 months, is that I do not think that I have solved language learning. I don't think I found the magic solution that'll that everyone should be doing. And if you're not using my approach, then you're a fool. No. I think that speak from day one is just the best way to learn a language if speaking it is your focus. Now, speaking is important to most people, but I've found that sometimes other aspects are more important. Like maybe they want to read really well in the language. Maybe they want to work professionally in the language, and that involves a lot of writing. Maybe they just want to pass an exam. Maybe they love the perfection of the language. So in that case, it's not really an issue with the learning philosophy, but that's more their personalities. They're a perfectionist and they don't like making mistakes. I would still argue with that mindset if it clashes with their goal that they just want to go out and speak the language with people and that's their focus, then they might say, I don't like speak from day one because I have to make mistakes and I don't like making mistakes, I don't like embarrassing myself. Then I would just say tough cookies. That's what you got to do if speaking is your goal. But if reading is your goal, if passing an exam is your goal, then speak from day one is definitely not the right approach, and you have to find a different one. But I wrote the book with that in mind. I did not want to please everyone, and I very happily tell people if I'm at a book signing and people are considering, like at a book event in a bookshop, and people haven't bought the book yet and they're hearing me talk and they're considering, is this right for me? I genuinely tell people why it would not work for them. I would tell people the kind of learner that should not buy my book, because if you try to make a course that works for everybody, it's just not going to be a good course. But I'm glad that you have been getting a lot out of it, despite the disagreement with the speak from day one approach, and that's totally fine. I'm very happy with that. I think that having different learning approaches and people having different preferences is really, really important, and I'm very glad that people have an open mind to check out my book, even if it clashes with their learning approach. So that really says a lot about you, and thank you for that. Really appreciate it. Okay, so let's see. Okay, Rasmus says, what would you suggest if the goal is to become a native as an adult? I immigrated and considered birth country, its language, culture, and people as unrelated. Okay, if you want to become a native as an adult, ooh, why? This is very, very important. Is instead of figuring out the best way to solve all these problems, you have to know, are you motivated enough to do it? Now, that really begs the question, why would you want to sound like a native? Now, this may sound like a silly question to some people. You know, obviously, that's what you would aspire to be. You aspire to speak the language like a native speaker would. But why do you need to speak it exactly like a native speaker would? So in my case, I want to speak a language as well as possible to aid in communication. And I want to speak with less of an accent so that it's easier for me to blend in, because I think a strong accent makes people feel this guy's a foreigner and they'll talk to me differently. But I always accept that ultimately the best I'll ever get is maybe in my best languages for a minute or two. If I'm super lucky, under the right circumstances, like no big limits necessarily, but under the right circumstances, they might think I'm a native speaker for a minute or two. But then I'm naturally going to let something slip. I'm going to make a tiny mistake. I'm going to use an expression just not exactly the right way. So you can't escape that. And like Richard Simcott and I have talked about this together in the past. If somebody says they've learned a language as an adult and reached native level, they are very likely lying or exaggerating. Because if somebody says that, then you can listen to them and you can hear them make a mistake, and you can say, I heard you made that mistake. That doesn't sound very native-like. And so it's not really a possible thing. And like the only reason to do this that I could think of is to mislead people about where you're from, and maybe if you want to be a spy. If you want to be a spy, you want to be in a spy movie, then you know you got to pass yourself off as a native speaker. But in the real world, it's not as necessary. It's fine if you have a little accent. Just make it your goal to have as good an accent that's similar to native speakers as you possibly can. But having a goal to become a native speaker when you're an adult, I don't know if that's really like, I'm sure there are people who could achieve it, but for my interests in terms of like spreading the learning encouragement to others, those anomalies aren't as interesting to me. If somebody's just like super intelligent, I'm more interested, can most people do this? Most people can definitely learn a language. They can definitely learn a language to fluency and even to mastery if they try hard enough, put enough time into it. But learning it to a native level, for most people, I don't know if that's possible, and I don't really know why you would need to, because you are from another country and you don't need to be ashamed of that. It's fine if you want to reduce your accent, if you want to speak as close as possible to a native. But don't worry about it too much. It's really not that big a deal. But maybe you don't like the answer, but I don't think personally that I don't think it's possible to have a a native equivalency as an adult. I think it's possible to fake it for a minute or two, but I promise you, if you claim to be a native speaker in the language, someone will be able to disprove you by catching you out at some stage. So yeah, that's what I have to say on that. Now, lots of interesting questions coming in. Let me see if I can get through as many of these as I can. And thanks everyone for watching this. And again, if this is for your first time on this channel, please subscribe. Click the subscribe button. Definitely check out, you might be able to see an eye in the top right corner. And otherwise, just look around the channel. Check out the playlist that we had from when Lauren was learning Esperanto, because that is definitely people's favorite. And I was realizing recently very few people have actually seen it because it's only on this channel. It's not on my main channel. So definitely check that out. It's it's one of my favorite series that I've ever done. And I can say that because I wasn't the central character. Somebody else was. But it was very, very enjoyable to watch for a lot of people. So definitely check that out just while you're asking these questions. You might not see an eye in the corner while this is live, but that's okay. You'll see it after the video, or just look on the channel and click playlists and you'll see it there. But anyone watching this after the fact will definitely see an eye, and that'll have cards clickable for you. Okay, so now continuing with your questions after that little promo of this channel. Let's see. Juan Anton asks, how do you use time zones to your advantage when talking to people online? Very interesting question. Oh, look at this. This is a good one to ask that I haven't heard before. Use time zones to your advantage. Okay. I'd be interested to hear other people's answers, so make sure to share your answers if something comes to you. But off the top of my head, I would say that... Okay, so maybe coordinating with teachers is one thing because they work particular hours and they work them regardless of time zones, like catering to other time zones. But one thing you might be able to do is find people to just learn with who are natives doing it naturally. Like, for instance, maybe during the evening, a lot of people sign on to like online gaming, and you can join rooms to like battle with people and so on. And you might find that when school is out, a lot of teenagers suddenly show up in those rooms, and you can, like, if you're young yourself, you can go in those rooms with them during the day because that's the only time you have internet. So you might be able to coordinate that way. That's the kind of thing I would think of, is how you can coordinate with native speakers who tend to be online at different times. But otherwise, I don't know. It depends on what your schedule is, and if that would conflict with other people, then your time zone actually would work to your advantage if it happens to be convenient in other locations. Without knowing the specifics of where you're coming from, I wouldn't be able to give a better answer, but I hope that idea helps a little bit. Okay, and let's see. Okay, Learning English asks, my first language is Cantonese. My family and friends all speak it. I badly want to speak English exactly like a native British person. Is it a possibility to acquire a British accent in a year? It's kind of similar to the question that was just asked, but you can definitely get a very good sounding British accent. And I have met a lot of people who have, at least as a teenager, sometimes as an adult, initially sounded very British, you know? And it depends on where you learn the language, of course. But I've met a lot of non-native English speakers who I initially thought were British. Then they might have said something weird that I caught my ear, and I think, oh, I don't know if this is a native speaker. But you can definitely have an accent that makes you essentially sound very British. And doing it in a year, I mean, based on how you're writing your questions that I could see here, it seems like your English is already very good. So that might be very possible. If you're speaking it like at an excellent level, then you only need to focus on your accent, and getting that down, certainly possible. But being confused for a British person, I don't know. You can make it so you're confused initially for a British person, but you're very likely going to be heard as a non-native speaker, because there's just too many things to learn to sound like a native speaker. There's too many expressions, too many cultural references, of the TV shows people grew up with that you didn't. You can go rewatch all those shows now. It's just a very unnatural way of doing it. And, you know, whenever somebody is sounds like they have an Irish accent and I speak to them, I might mention, I don't know, Father Ted, for instance. Oh, I'll talk about Father Ted, a show that we really loved in Ireland. And they'd be like, oh, what's that? And then I'm caught off. I think immediately, oh, that's right, because they're not a native English speaker. They only learned the language in the last 5 years, even though they learned it very well. They just did not grow up in the country. So I'm just never going to think that they're an Irish person, because that part of it is missing, growing up and the experiences you have that you just can't really study for. But again, you can definitely get to the stage where you sound very, very British. And within a year, if you're starting with a fluency, and definitely if you've got a mastery level, it's possible. But these goals of sounding like native speakers, I wouldn't worry too much about them, if that makes sense. Okay. And yeah, I saw Dominica's meant to say conjugations. That's totally fine. Samantha says, hi Benny, I've read Fluent in 3 Months 5 times. Wow. I don't even know if I've read it 5 times, even in the proofreading stage. I love the book and recently bought your Spanish language checking Spanish, and I'm a big fan. I'd love to know what language you would like to learn next. Oh, I always get this question. I don't know what language I want to learn next. I'm kind of in at the moment learning dog language, although that's not quite as interesting in terms of people following missions and so on, because communicating with animals is a kind of a very interesting process. I'll make a video about it because I find it so interesting how we learn. Look at this, my hand is a pillow. Yes it is. I find it very interesting how you communicate the concepts like sit and bark and stop barking and let's go outside. How you communicate this, so that's just an interesting little kind of side project for me. That's what I'm doing now. But my next project, I don't really know. I don't tend to plan them that far in advance. I have a few ideas, but I wouldn't announce them until I was absolutely sure. So I don't really know what my next mission is. Dominikas, do you know if your book is available in Lithuanian? I think it might be. I have my book in a couple of languages back here, and I have to double check. But I'll tell you what, the easiest way, because I genuinely don't know. If you scroll through my Instagram and go back about 3 or 4 years, I don't post that often, so you'll scroll like for a minute and you'll see it. You'll start to see me show pictures of non-English covers of my book, and I took a few pictures, and I honestly I know I should know what languages my own book has been translated into. But if you camera's getting a bit bright, if you check that out, you might see Lithuanian. So I'm not sure, but that's a great question. Okay, let's see what else you guys are asking. Okay, this is a good one. Dominica says, do you like eavesdropping on foreign languages, acting like you don't understand what they're saying, and then surprising them and showing that you did understand everything? So eavesdropping, I definitely do like doing that in public. It's not necessarily eavesdropping, it's more them presuming other people can't understand them. And so, for instance, I always joke with Lauren that I was like, I'd be on a subway or something, and I'd turn to her and I'd say, so he's telling his friend that he's cheated on his wife with his piano teacher, and she'd be like, I don't want to know this. And that's kind of a funny form of eavesdropping, is kind of people's weird things they share in public just because they think others can't understand them. But yeah, I think what I've done just for like, if someone talks about me specifically, then I might correct them, and that's always funny. Like when I was in China, they didn't use the word foreigner, but they used the word American a lot. And it's so interesting that if they see a white face, they presumed it was American. So I would hear people talking about me, and they would say "Megoren," and I'd be like, "Oh, for sure, Megoren, sure, Ireland," and I say proudly I'm Irish. And then they would be so shocked because they were saying that in Mandarin to one another loudly enough that I was likely to hear it, but they just presumed I didn't speak any Mandarin. And then I would correct them, and eventually I stopped doing that because I realized that I had to have a more complex conversation of explaining where Ireland is, because even though I was definitely saying it right, they had never heard of Ireland before, and I had to say it's next to Ingwa, and then they'd be like, "Oh, you're from England," essentially in Mandarin, and I'd be like, "No, not from England, but whatever, who cares? I don't even want to explain this anymore." So that's kind of something that has happened, that I'll understand people, and it's always very interesting. As I'm walking up and down the street, I'll always hear people, especially in New York, I'll hear people speaking in other languages, and I'll catch little glimpses of conversations. And, like, you know, as I'm passing them, I'm not just going to stop them and start speaking a language to them. But if I hear someone speaking about a problem they have and they can't find somewhere, I'll turn to them and I'll start giving the answer. And they may be surprised someone in New York is randomly speaking to them in Portuguese. But it is fun. It is definitely a fun superpower to have, I should say. Okay. Let's see what else you guys have been asking me. Benjamin says, I'm 100% certain about learning German and Czech. I'm currently learning German and it's going well. I want to use... I know I want to use these languages, but I'm learning French because it doesn't give me a specific reason. Okay, should I learn French even if I may not have good reasons to? I feel like I may regret it. There are times I like French and other times I enjoy speaking with the effort. How do you recommend what language I should choose to learn? Okay, well, so you're 100% certain about learning German and Czech. I don't know what level you would be at those, but you are ambivalent about learning French because it doesn't give you a specific practical reason to. So why are you interested in learning French? Because that's an important question to ask. It's more, you're listing all these languages to me, and it's quite a lot, and you might be spreading yourself thin if you're putting just a little bit of effort, because my preference is always to learn one language at a time. The way I got to be able to call myself a polyglot was not because I took all of these languages and learned them at once. It's because I spent serious time on each language. Not necessarily the 3 months that I have in some of my projects. Some of them had taken years. That's years of dedication to one specific language, and then moving to another language only when I was sure the first language was at a particular level. And sometimes a practical reason is not what you need, because people always they pick a language like Chinese, they would say, because, you know, more people speak it, or they list various languages and they think of their job abilities within that language. But what I would say is sometimes there isn't a practical reason, but you just are really passionate, and that is a good reason to learn language. Like, there's not a practical reason for me to learn Irish. I'm not going to work for the Irish government necessarily, but I just really wanted to learn it. It's a part of my culture, my history, so there isn't some reward for me for learning the language once I've reached a certain level. But there is going to be just my personal feeling of I was really interested in doing this, and I'm happy that I did it. So maybe that's your case in French, that you just really want to do it. You're interested in French culture and you like the sound of the language and you have French friends. Those are great reasons. But if you just want to learn it because, you know, you just kind of like how it sounds, then I would discourage you from putting energy into it, because that's not a good reason. That's not going to sustain you through months or years of hard work. But if you have a solid reason, whether it be practical or personal passion, then that might be a good reason to learn it. But don't spread yourself too thin. I would try to focus on the languages. I would focus on one language at a time. So maybe French is going to be the next language, and you won't work as hard on your German and Czech, but it always depends on the person, and that's totally okay. But I can't really tell you which language to learn. I can only tell you that if you if you would not enjoy learning and speaking it, then don't do it. That's not a good reason to learn the language. If you just kind of feel like maybe why not, if that makes sense. There has to be really good reason that's going to keep you working at it very hard. Okay? All right, next. Dominicus, what do you think about Duolingo as a learning tool? Personally, I find the little I've used of Duolingo myself, because it's never been at the time I've needed to learn a new language, it wasn't available in Duolingo. But now it does have most languages. If I had most languages I would have learned if I was starting now. But what I found is it is good for filling up those dead moments in your day. So if you're waiting for, I don't know, waiting for an elevator or lift, and if you're waiting for a friend, waiting in the supermarket queue, then take out your phone and do a little Duolingo. But for an actual dedicated study session, I would tend to encourage people to do other things, like learning vocabulary specific to conversations that you're having actual conversations themselves with that be with an exchange partner or a teacher you might get on a site like italki. And there are tools that help you with specific things. I'm a big fan of the Language Pod 101 series if I'm learning to improve my listening comprehension, to understand the language as it's spoken to me. So there are tools that do specific things. I think Duolingo is a very fun way to learn the language, but the little I've experienced of it, I would use it more between my other learning sessions as kind of a relaxed way of passing time. Maybe other people could disagree with me, or maybe it's changed enough since I've used it last that it's like a really in-depth study tool. But that's kind of just my personal opinion. I wouldn't, if you find it works very well for you and you're making lots of progress with it, then I'm just wrong, and it's okay to be wrong. I always tell people I make at least 200 mistakes a day, and so don't worry about that. If I say I don't particularly love Duolingo, I would not say that is reason for you guys to not learn it at all yourselves. Okay, so last few questions now, and I'll start wrapping it up since we're getting up to the full hour, and I hope I get through as many questions as I can for you guys, and I hope you've enjoyed seeing our little Shatsy here as he's resting. Again, reminders, subscribe, click the notification bell. I'm going to try and do more of the general Q&As on this channel in future, and I'll do the non-general, the specific ones on my Benny Lewis channel. So the free-for-all language learning questions, I'm going to do them more on this channel here, so you won't want to miss those. But don't worry, we're not done yet. I'm going to do a few more questions. Let's see. Chelsea, how do you learn grammar? I'm learning Spanish currently. I'm struggling to learn grammar. First thing I would say is to not learn the grammar at the start. Get as much exposure to the language through speaking it and doing some basic, reading exercises and so on. And not necessarily focusing on it, but just the exposure to it is going to naturally give you an understanding of the grammar, an intuitive sense of it. And then when you've got enough that, if you saw me say earlier that I might say, ayer yo comer, I might like really poorly form a sentence from a grammatical perspective, but I've been able to say it. Once I've had enough conversations, and this is what I did with my Spanish, as I just started speaking it incorrectly. I started speaking Tarzan Spanish. But once I had enough exposure, I heard people say, ayer yo comí. I heard them say it enough times that it started to get into my head. And I didn't just naturally burst into saying it then. But what that meant was I got a Spanish grammar book. I would grab it behind me. It's one of these here that I'm pointing at. I would grab it, but I don't want to wake up this cute little fella here. He looks so comfortable. Look at him. Oh my God, he's so cute. Oh, he knows I was talking about him. So now you go back to sleep, Shatsy. You go back to sleep. Good boy. So I would grab the book back there. But there's a Harrop's Spanish Grammar. And Harrop's Spanish Grammar. And that's kind of what I use as an intermediate learner. And it's pure grammar explanations, but only as an intermediate learner. Because once I had enough exposure to the language, when I read those explanations, and it said sorry, this guy's really distracting me in a good way. It said that verbs that end in er sometimes use an accented I in the first person, like the whatever way it explained it. I thought to myself, that's why they say it that way sometimes. Oh, that makes sense to me now. So, oh, what's wrong, little fella? Don't show people your private parts. We have to keep this video PG, you know. So I have to like protect you here. So I saw the explanation, but I saw it in the context of having used the language enough that it really burned into me. So I would read a grammar explanation after getting exposure, and it's much more interesting. It's more fun that way, as well as kind of helping you naturally pick it up. Okay, Juan says, do you know how many different languages say woof or other animal sounds? There's a really good comic somewhere that shows this. I know that I see it floating around Facebook sometimes, that in maybe Spanish it's either ow or wow, written UAU, and I know it's ow in a lot of other languages, so not woof. I think the only language it's woof in is English for sure. And when you hear other languages, you start to realize dogs actually do say ow, 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 you know, rather than woof, woof. I can't imagine this guy saying woof and forming the F with his lower lip. No, he disagrees. He's looking at me like, are you crazy? I'd never say woof. So other languages have different ways of describing that. But I know if you just Google woof in other languages, you'll probably see and click images after you search that. You see a visualization that I think is probably represents it very well. What language are you going to teach most of Shatsy's commands in? Most are probably going to be in English because I want to make sure Lauren is able to use them herself. I've mentioned a couple of simple ones that we might say. I think she agreed to one already because we haven't started training him just yet. But I think one we're going to say for look at me is mírame, mírame, because that's one thing you do when you're training a dog is you get it to give you eye contact. You kind of point your finger initially at your eyes, and that means he's looking at you instead of all the squirrels running around in the park. So I think we're going to use mírame, and we've already talked about that one. But most of the commands are probably going to be in English just because I want to make sure I'm not like confusing Lauren, and if we give the dog to somebody else, I don't want to restrict ourselves to only having polyglot dog walker friends, because that would make it very difficult if we go on trips and we want someone to take care of Shatsy, you know. So up to now, Shatsy doesn't even know his own name. He hasn't learned that yet, so we're taking it nice and slow for now. Okay, and just the last couple of questions for you guys. Chelsea asks, what was your first language? My first language after English. In school, I learned German and Irish, but I did not learn them very well. So I always tell people, essentially, from my own perspective, I always feel like my first language that I truly learned as an adult was Spanish, because that's the one I put real effort in. I was present in school during language lessons for German and Irish, but I didn't really learn them until several years later, and I came back and tried to do it independently. But Spanish was the very first one, and you look a bit on my blog, you'll see a bit of my backstory for that. Okay, I'm gonna have to skip through a couple of questions now. I'm sorry about that, but you guys can catch me in more of these later. After I get back, I'll make sure to announce get back from my next trips for the next 2 weeks. I'll announce when my next live video is going to be. So Dominica's repeats the question there. When's a good time to start learning a third language? Very quickly, I would say wait until your second language is at a B2 level. This is something, if you look at my previous live videos, I definitely get into plenty. Dominica's asks if I have a Discord server. I do have a Discord server. Let me grab you the link. If anyone knows what that means, you'll enjoy this, and I'll copy it into my chat here. Invite people, copy and paste. Yep, boom, that's my Discord link for you in the comments. But yeah, sorry if I didn't get to your questions today. And Shatsy is starting to stir, as you can see. Isn't he such a cute ball? Oh, Shatsy. He's thinking about moving, I think. It'll take him a few minutes, but he'll get there eventually. So, yeah, this has been good. It's been fun, everybody. Thanks for watching. And again, subscribe to this channel. You likely are not subscribed already. And check out other videos that you would see on the channel, especially the series of Lauren Learning Esperanto. I promise it's worth it. It's a really, really fun series to watch. And, you know, short videos, 5 or 10 minute long videos. We recorded every second of her learning it, and I edited it afterwards, so you didn't miss a single realization. A nice little experiment. Dominicus, can you talk to me there? No. I get so many emails. I don't use that. You can talk to one another, and you'll see how it works in the chats. But there's I don't use the Discord server to have quick chats with people, because I would just spend all day answering questions. That's what these live videos are for. So if you have any other questions on your mind, definitely come on these live videos. I will, in Discord, once we have enough people there, make sure I announce live videos, and I might have very brief moments of saying hi to people there. But general language learning questions I'm going to keep doing during the live sessions. Okay? So thanks everybody for enjoying the stream. Really appreciate it. And I hope that I will see you guys in the next one. Thanks for subscribing. Thanks for following along. Thanks for watching the other videos on this channel. And don't forget to click thumbs up for Shatsy. Not for me. Don't give me a thumbs up. I'm just a boring human. Give Shatsy a thumbs up. Or a paw up. Isn't that right, Shatsy? I promise he's not dead. I promise he is not dead right now. But Shatsy wants you to give him a paws up. Okay? So thanks everyone for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Alright? Happy language learning!